Daniel Westbrook slammed the divorce papers onto the kitchen counter and said, "Sign them." "Myra, I'm done pretending this is a marriage." She looked up from her coffee, calm as still water, and said nothing. He mistook her silence for surrender. He had no idea that at that exact moment her phone was lighting up with a message from her legal team confirming that her firm had just completed the hostile acquisition of 60% of his company's outstanding shares. She owned him and he didn't know it yet. If this story hits different, drop the name of your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this one travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it before this story is over, because what's coming will change the way you see every quiet person in your life. The morning Daniel Westbrook decided to end his marriage began like every other morning that had slowly been killing him for the past 2 years. With silence. Not the peaceful kind. Not the comfortable silence of two people who know each other so well that words become unnecessary. This was the other kind. The kind that sits in a room like a third person nobody invited. The kind that follows you from the kitchen to the bathroom to the garage, pressing against your chest like a hand that won't let go. He stood at the kitchen island in their Atherton home. A house with 7 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, a wine cellar he never used, and a backyard that looked like something out of a magazine nobody actually read. And he poured himself a cup of coffee that he would barely touch. The house was immaculate. It was always immaculate. Myra kept it that way. Or rather, she had someone keep it that way. Though Daniel had long since stopped paying attention to the difference. He heard her moving somewhere upstairs. The soft click of heels on hardwood. The distant murmur of a phone call in a voice too low to understand. She was always on the phone. He used to ask who she was talking to. She would say, "Work." And he would nod. And that would be the end of it. Because in Daniel's mind, Myra's work was background noise. She was a consultant of some kind. She traveled occasionally. She wore expensive clothes that she never explained and carried a laptop bag that she never left open on the kitchen table. He had never once thought to ask more than the surface questions, because the surface answers had always been enough for him to move on and think about something more important. Like his company. Like his revenue projections. Like the board meeting he had in 48 hours that he had not yet fully prepared for. He was in every professional sense of the word a man of consequence. He ran Westbrook Technologies. Or West Tech as the industry press called it. A mid-size software infrastructure company that he had built from a 2-person operation in his apartment in Palo Alto 11 years ago into a firm with 230 employees, 3 domestic offices, and a valuation that 18 months ago had peaked at just over $400 million. He was the kind of man who got profiled in tech magazines, the kind who gave speeches at industry conferences. The kind who shook hands with venture capitalists and smiled for photographs and said things like disruption and ecosystem with a completely straight face. He was also quietly and without fully admitting it to himself a man whose company was drowning. He reached into the front pocket of his briefcase. A ritual he performed every morning before leaving the house. A quick inventory of whatever paperwork needed attention. And his fingers found an envelope he didn't recognize. It wasn't his. It wasn't addressed to him. It had no stamp. No return address. Just his name written in handwriting he didn't immediately place on the front in dark ink. He turned it over. Set it down. Picked up his coffee. Set the coffee down. Picked the envelope back up. He told himself later that he had no good reason to open it. That it might have been private. That a reasonable man would have set it aside and asked about it later. But Daniel Westbrook was not feeling particularly reasonable that morning, because sitting on the corner of the same briefcase was the other envelope. The one he had put there himself 3 days ago after a conversation with his attorney. A meeting he had attended alone without telling Myra. Without giving her any indication that he had spent 45 minutes in a downtown Palo Alto law office discussing the most efficient and least contentious path to the dissolution of their 6-year marriage. The divorce petition. His name on the signature line. a blank line beneath it waiting for hers. He looked at both envelopes for a long moment. Then he opened the one he hadn't put there. The paper inside was dense with legal language, which immediately told Daniel that whatever this was, it wasn't casual. His eyes moved quickly across the first paragraph, catching words and phrases the way a drowning man catches debris: acquisition, controlling interest, binding offer, Riven Equity Partners. He stopped. He read that last phrase again. Riven Equity Partners. He knew that name. Of course he knew that name. Every founder in Silicon Valley who had been paying attention for the last 5 years knew that name the way sailors know the names of storms. Riven Equity Partners was a private investment firm. Almost aggressively private. The kind of firm that had no public-facing website, no social media presence, no interviews with the financial press, no named partners listed anywhere that Daniel had ever been able to find. And he had tried to find them because 18 months ago Riven had quietly acquired a competitor of his, a company called Lumen Systems. And then within 8 months had restructured Lumen's entire operational model and flipped it for a figure that the industry was still talking about. They were ghosts. Powerful, precise, and invisible ghosts. And now apparently, they wanted West Tech. He turned to the last page. His eyes went to the signature line the way his tongue goes to a sore tooth against his will, already knowing it's going to hurt. The signature was neat, deliberate, and completely familiar. Myra Sultani, his wife's maiden name. The name she had kept professionally, though he had barely registered that detail when she mentioned it 3 years into their marriage. Assuming it was a simple professional preference. The kind of thing modern women did nothing to analyze or question. He stood at that kitchen island for what might have been 30 seconds or might have been 10 minutes. The clock on the wall said 7:14. He didn't feel time passing. He felt the floor. Specifically the way it felt completely solid beneath his feet. And found that confusing because everything else had just become completely unstable. Daniel. He turned. Myra was standing in the entrance to the kitchen. She was dressed for travel. Dark blazer. Tailored slacks. A leather carry-on bag over one shoulder. Her hair was pulled back. Her expression was exactly as it always was in the mornings. Composed. Quiet. Giving nothing away. He held up the acquisition document. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. She did not look surprised. She did not look guilty. She looked like someone who had been waiting for a specific bus and had just seen it rounding the corner right on schedule. "You opened that," she said. "It was in my briefcase. I know where I put it." He stared at her. "What is this?" "Myra." She set her bag down on the kitchen chair. She didn't rush. She didn't fidget. She pulled out the chair and sat down with the same ease that people sit down in their own living rooms. Except they were in their kitchen and Daniel was holding a document that suggested the entire landscape of his life was geological fiction. "It's an acquisition offer," she said. "I can read," he said. "What I am asking you is why your name is on it." "Because it's my firm." He put the document on the counter. He looked at his hands. He looked at her. He said very carefully, "Riven Equity Partners is your firm?" "Yes." "You founded it?" "Yes." "And you've been," he stopped. "Started again." "For how long?" "I started Riven 9 years ago." She said 3 years before we met. The coffee maker beeped behind him. Neither of them moved. 9 years. He repeated. "Yes. You've been running a private equity firm for 9 years?" "Yes. And you told me you were a consultant." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I am a consultant. Among other things." "Myra." His voice came out lower than he intended. Rougher. Like something that had been waiting behind a door and had finally been let out. "That firm has the valuation on Riven Equity Partners is I've heard numbers. People in this industry talk about Riven like it's." He stopped again. "Started again. How much are you worth?" She held his gaze. More than you know. He laughed. But it wasn't a real laugh. It was the kind of sound a person makes when the alternative is something they can't afford. That's not an answer. No. She agreed. It's not. He looked at the divorce petition in his briefcase. Then he looked at her. He made a decision not to bring it up yet. Though he couldn't have explained exactly why. Something about the mathematics of the moment. 2 bombs in the same room. Only one person knowing about both of them. Why? He said instead. Why didn't you tell me? She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her expression. Not quite grief. Not quite anger. Something older and more tired than either of those. Because she said, I wanted to be your wife. Not a portfolio. He didn't know what to do with that. So he did what he always did. When he didn't know what to do, he picked up his briefcase. He said he needed to get to the office and he left. He drove to work on autopilot. That was the only word for it. His hands were on the wheel. His eyes were on the road. His foot was on the gas. But Daniel Westbrook himself was somewhere else entirely running and rerunning a conversation that had lasted less than 4 minutes and had somehow managed to dismantle every assumption he had built his understanding of his own life upon. He kept coming back to the same question. Cycling through it like a screen that won't stop refreshing. How did he not know? Not the financial details. Not the specifics of Riven's portfolio or Myra's stake or whatever number she had avoided saying out loud in their kitchen. But the basic architecture of it. The daily reality of it. He was a man who prided himself on reading people. He had built a company by reading people. By knowing which engineers to hire and which investors to trust and which competitors to watch. He sat across from strangers in conference rooms and within 20 minutes could tell you whether they were bluffing. He had lived with this woman for 6 years. He had slept beside her. Eaten across from her. Argued with her about the temperature of the house and the direction the toilet paper hung and whether they should get a dog. He had attended her mother's funeral and held her hand and said the right things. He had watched her pack for trips and unpack from trips and answer phone calls in that low voice and carry that laptop bag and wear those expensive clothes, and he had filed all of it under Myra's work and moved on. He had never once asked the right question. His phone buzzed as he pulled into the parking structure beneath the West Tech offices. It was his COO. Eli Morrow. Which was not unusual. Eli called or texted before 9 a.m. Roughly 4 days out of 5 because Eli was the kind of person who interpreted, "We'll deal with it tomorrow," as a challenge. He sent it to voicemail. He sat in the car for a minute. Then he went upstairs. The West Tech offices occupied 2 floors of a glass building in downtown Palo Alto. And on any normal morning, Daniel could walk through that space and feel the thing he had built. The low hum of a machine he had designed from the ground up. People moving with purpose. Screens flickering with data that meant something. The accumulated energy of a company that mattered. That morning he walked through and saw it differently. He saw the empty desks in the engineering wing that had been empty for 4 months since 2 senior developers had left for a competitor. He saw the way his sales team's whiteboard, visible through the glass wall of their room, had fewer deals in the closing column than it had in February. He saw the face of his CFO. Renata Chow. When she looked up and caught his eye and gave him the small careful smile that he had been interpreting as collegial and was now, in the harsh light of this particular morning reading, as something else entirely. The practiced calm of someone who knows more bad news is coming and is bracing for the conversation. He went directly to his office and closed the door. He sat at his desk. He pulled out the acquisition offer and read it properly. This time not the panicked skimming of the kitchen counter, but a full deliberate read. The way he read documents when money was involved and decisions had to be made. Riven Equity Partners was offering to acquire West Tech at a valuation of $280 million. He sat with that number. 18 months ago. His internal projections had put the company at $410 million. He had been planning to take it public within the year. He had been telling investors, telling the board, telling himself that West Tech was on a trajectory that made early exit strategies premature. The offer on his desk was a polite, legally precise, contractual ironclad message that said, "Your trajectory was wrong." And his wife had sent it. He was still sitting there staring at the document when his door opened, and Eli Morrow walked in without knocking, which was his standard operating procedure, and which Daniel had stopped objecting to years ago. Eli was 41-62 and had the particular energy of someone who runs half marathons recreationally and considers 7 hours of sleep a personal failure. He was Daniel's oldest friend in the industry, his COO, and the only person at West Tech who was allowed to say things like, "You're wrong about this," to Daniel's face without getting fired. He looked at the document on Daniel's desk. He looked at Daniel. He said, "You got one. Two." Daniel's head came up. "What do you mean you got one? Two?" Eli sat down in the chair across the desk. He put his own copy of the Riven acquisition offer on the desktop. Different envelope. Same document. Delivered to the office. To me specifically. As COO. When? Yesterday. I was going to talk to you this morning. He paused. You look like you haven't slept. I slept fine. This was a lie. Have you heard of Riven Equity Partners? Of course I've heard of Riven. Eli's voice was careful. I've been trying to find out who runs that firm for 2 years. Nobody knows. Every time I've tried to get background on them, it goes nowhere. He looked at the document. But they clearly know us. This offer is Daniel. This isn't a fishing expedition. Whoever put this together has been inside our books. The numbers they're referencing. The structural language. This is someone who has been watching us for a long time. I know who runs it. Daniel said. Eli stared at him. You know who runs Rivendell Equity Partners? Yes. Who? Daniel looked at his hands on the desk. He looked at the acquisition offer. He looked at his friend. Myra. He said. The silence that followed was the loudest silence Daniel had experienced since the one in the kitchen that morning. And that one had been extremely loud. Eli said. I'm sorry. Your wife Myra? Yes. Myra who teaches? Eli stopped. What does Myra do? I've never actually been clear on that. Consulting. Daniel said. And then because the word now tasted like a bad joke. Apparently. Eli leaned back in his chair. He put his hands on his head. He looked at the ceiling. He said. How long has she been running Rivendell? 9 years. 9. Eli brought his hands down. Daniel. 9 years. That means when you two met. She was already, I know. That means the Lumen Systems acquisition. I know. Eli. That means she is depending on whose numbers you trust. Probably worth somewhere in the I know. Daniel said sharply enough that Eli stopped. A beat of silence. Then Eli said very carefully, Did you know before today? Daniel looked at him. What do you think? Eli exhaled slowly. I think he said. That you are sitting here looking like a man who has just been told that gravity works differently than he thought. And that if you had known, you would not look like that. No. Daniel said. I didn't know. Eli was quiet for a moment. Then he said. What are you going to do? Daniel picked up the acquisition offer. Put it back down. Picked it up again. I'm going to find out. He said everything I should have asked 6 years ago. Tat 10. He spent the rest of that morning in his office with the door closed. Which was unusual enough that Renata knocked twice to ask if he needed anything. And Eli sent a text that said, Only talk when ready. He read everything he could find about Riven Equity Partners. Which was, as Eli had correctly identified, almost nothing. The firm existed in the industry the way a deep water current exists in an ocean. You could see the effects of it. The patterns it left on the surface. without ever being able to look directly at it. 3 significant acquisitions in the last 6 years. All of them mid-size tech infrastructure companies. All of them restructured and either revitalized or strategically dissolved within 18 months. No failures on record. No public statements. No named leadership on any corporate filing beyond a registered agent in Delaware. He found one reference to Myra Sultani. A single line in a 2-year-old Harvard Business Review article about the evolution of stealth investment strategies. Her name listed in the acknowledgements under a section about firms that had declined to comment. He had read that article. He remembered reading it. He had not recognized her name in it because he knew her as Myra Westbrook in his daily life, because he had never once connected the quiet woman who drank chamomile tea and kept their house immaculate and said work when he asked who was on the phone with the invisible force that had been reshaping parts of his industry for the better part of a decade. He opened his email. He had over the years sent Myra perhaps 300 emails. Most of them logistical. Time of dinner reservation. Flight information. She had asked him to forward one extended chain about whether to repaint the living room. He scrolled back through them, looking now with new eyes at her responses, which were always brief, always direct, always arriving within minutes. Regardless of what time he sent his message, he had interpreted that promptness as available. He now understood it as efficient. He found himself thinking about specific moments. A dinner party 18 months ago at the home of one of his investors where Myra had sat beside a man named Gerald Howe, a venture capitalist who controlled one of the larger funds in the Bay Area. And the two of them had talked quietly for most of the evening while Daniel held court at the other end of the table. He had glanced over at her once and thought vaguely that it was nice she was having a real conversation for once. That she sometimes seemed bored at these things. He now wondered what they had actually been talking about. He thought about the business trip she had taken to Tokyo 8 months ago. 4 days. She had brought him back a very specific bottle of whiskey. A small batch brand from a distillery in Hokkaido that he had mentioned once in passing as something he'd read about and would like to try someday. He had been touched. He had thought it meant she listened. She did listen. He was only now beginning to understand how completely. At 11:45 he looked up from his desk and found himself staring at the divorce petition. He'd been carrying it in his briefcase for 3 days. He had not yet told her it was there. He had been building up to it in the particular way that people build up to things they know will cause pain. Which is to say, he had been moving further and further from the moment rather than toward it, telling himself he was being thoughtful when he was actually being afraid. He was still afraid. But now the fear had a different shape. Because the man who had decided 3 days ago to end his marriage had made that decision based on a specific understanding of who Myra was. A woman who had grown distant. Who seemed uninterested in him. Who existed in his life like a beautiful and permanent piece of furniture. Present. Decorative. Immovable. But ultimately passive. He had been ending his marriage to a woman he had invented. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Myra. She had sent him an address in San Francisco and a time Thursday 2 p.m. Below that. I think you should come. He stared at the message for a long time. Then he wrote back. I'll be there. He put the phone down. He looked at the divorce petition. He looked at the acquisition offer from Riven Equity Partners. 2 envelopes. He had thought this morning that they were 2 different problems. He was beginning to understand that they were the same problem wearing different suits. And that the person who understood that, who had perhaps understood it for longer than he wanted to consider, was his quiet, calm, chamomile tea drinking wife who had built an empire in the spaces between his conversations and had never once needed him to notice. The coffee he had poured that morning was still on his desk. Untouched and cold. He picked it up anyway. It tasted exactly as bad as he deserved. Daniel did not sleep that night. He lay on his side of the bed. The left side. Always the left side. A habit so ingrained he could not have told you when it started. and stared at the ceiling while Myra breathed quietly beside him. She had come home at 7 o'clock. She had made dinner. Or rather, she had ordered dinner the same Thai place they had been ordering from for 4 years. And she had set the containers on the counter and said, "Food's here," in the same tone she used to say everything, which was to say a tone that gave nothing away and asked for nothing back. They had eaten. They had not spoken about the acquisition offer. They had not spoken about Riven. They had not spoken about the divorce petition still sitting in his briefcase, which he had moved from the office to the car to the hallway closet in a sequence of small relocations that he told himself was strategy. And which was, if he was being honest, something much simpler and much less flattering. He was scared. Not of her. That was the strange part. He was not scared of Myra. He was scared of the version of himself that the last 24 hours had begun to assemble a man-shaped outline filled with assumptions and blind spots and 6 years of questions he had never thought to ask. At 2 o'clock in the morning, he gave up on sleep. He went downstairs to his office, sat at his desk, and opened his laptop. He typed Riven Equity Partners founding history. He had done this search before. He got the same results he always got. A sparse corporate registration in Delaware. A registered agent's address. A few industry references that mentioned the firm by name without providing any detail about its leadership or structure. But this time he searched differently. This time he searched for Myra Sultani specifically, not as his wife's maiden name filed away in some mental drawer marked professional preference, but as a person in her own right. What came back made him sit back in his chair. There was not much. She had been apparently extremely deliberate about her public footprint. But what there was told a story he had been standing inside for 6 years without ever reading the walls. A brief mention in a Stanford alumni publication from 14 years ago noting Myra Sultani as a graduate of their MBA program with distinction. A single panel appearance at a private equity symposium in London 7 years ago listed in the program under a session titled Stealth Capital and Strategic Patience. One line in a financial trade publication from 3 years ago in a story about the Lumen Systems restructuring describing the acquiring firm's principal as a notably reclusive figure whose identity remains a matter of industry speculation. Industry speculation. His industry. The same world he moved through every day at conferences and dinners and board meetings and golf outings, talking to everyone he could talk to. Building the network he had always believed was his greatest professional asset. And in all of that time, in all of those rooms, the most consequential person connected to his professional life had been sleeping in his bed. He closed the laptop. He put his head in his hands. He sat there for a long time. Then he heard a sound behind him and turned. Myra was standing in the doorway in a grey robe. Her hair loose. A glass of water in her hand. She looked at him the way she had looked at him that morning across the kitchen. Not surprised. Not guilty. Not performing anything. "You should sleep," she said. "I can't." She came in and sat in the armchair in the corner, the one she had chosen when they furnished this room, and which he had always privately thought was positioned slightly too far from the desk, slightly outside the main geography of the room, as if she had deliberately chosen a seat that was present but peripheral. He wondered now if she had done that on purpose. "How long have you known about the company?" he said. "About what's been happening with West Tech?" She looked at her water glass. 2 years. 2 years. The number landed in his chest like something thrown hard. 2 years, he repeated. "I started watching when you lost the Datacore contract," she said. "The one you told me fell through because of market timing." He remembered the Datacore contract. He remembered the way he had explained it to her over dinner casually with the practiced confidence of a man who had already decided how the story was going to be told. Market timing. Competitive pressure. Nothing fundamental. That wasn't market timing. "Muth," he said. It was not a question. "No," she said. "Your pricing model was 18 months behind the curve. And your lead engineer had already accepted an offer from a competitor. He left 6 weeks later. You told me he left for personal reasons. He stared at her. How do you know that? Because I did what I always do. She said simply. I paid attention. The silence that followed was different from the ones that had filled their house for the last 2 years. Those silences had been empty. This one was full. Over full. Pressing against the walls of the room, dense with everything that had been living in it unacknowledged. Why didn't you say anything? He said. If you knew the company was in trouble. I tried. She said. And something moved in her voice then. The first crack in the surface. Small and quickly controlled. But real. I tried twice. Once at dinner 11 months ago when I said that I'd been reading about infrastructure consolidation trends and asked if West Tech had considered a strategic partnership. You told me I didn't understand how the industry worked. He opened his mouth. Closed it. And once in the car. She continued. On the way back from Marcus and Ellen's anniversary party. I mentioned a firm I knew that was looking at acquisition targets in your space, and I asked if you'd ever thought about what an exit strategy might look like. You said you weren't interested in being someone's acquisition target and changed the subject to the Giants game. He remembered the car ride. He did not remember the conversation she was describing, which was its own kind of answer. Myra, I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad. She said. And she said it so evenly without anger that he believed her, which somehow made it worse. I'm telling you because you asked. You asked how long I've known, and the honest answer is that I've been trying to help you for almost a year, and the only way I had left was to do it without your permission. He looked at the acquisition offer on his desk. By buying my company. By saving it. She said. There's a difference. He stood up. Not out of anger. He didn't feel angry, which surprised him because he had expected to feel angry. He felt something more like vertigo. The feeling of a man who has been walking with complete confidence on a surface he has just been told is not solid ground. I need you to explain something to me, he said, not about the business. About us. He turned to face her. Why didn't you tell me who you were when we met? Before we got married. Sometime in the 6 years we've been living in this house? Why? She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then she said, Do you remember the second time we had dinner? He didn't immediately. Their first date had been at a restaurant in Hayes Valley that a mutual friend had recommended. He remembered that. The second one was less distinct. We went to that wine bar on California Street, she said. You talked for most of the night about West Tech. About the round you were closing. The vision you had. What you were building. I sat across from you and I listened. And I thought. This is a man who knows exactly who he is. Everything in his life has a place. Everything has a purpose. She looked at her water glass again. And I thought about what it would mean to tell you on a second date that I ran a firm with more capital under management than your round was asking for. I thought about what that would do to the conversation. To the dynamic. To you. You were protecting me, he said. And he could hear the edge in his own voice. The reflexive pride pushing back against the idea. I was protecting us, she said, or trying to. I thought if you knew from the beginning that I had what I have, you would never see me as a person. I would become a resource. A connection. An asset. She looked up at him. I didn't want to be your asset, Daniel. I wanted to be your wife. He sat back down. He felt the weight of what she had said settling over him like something physical. Something he would have to learn to carry differently. And when you fell in love with me, he said slowly, you thought you couldn't tell me then either. Every year that passed made it harder, she said, not easier. Because every year meant more explanation. More justification for the silence. I kept telling myself I would find the right moment. The right way. And the right moment never came. He thought about the divorce petition in his closet. He thought about the right moment he had given her to have that conversation. Which was approximately no moment. Because he had been too busy managing his own narrative to leave space for hers. When did you decide to move on the acquisition? He asked. 4 months ago, she said, when I saw the Q3 numbers. How did you see our Q3 numbers? She looked at him steadily. I have people who are very good at their jobs. He almost laughed. He did not laugh. Right. He rubbed his face with both hands. Right. Of course you do. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside. Somewhere in the neighborhood. A dog was barking 2 short bursts and then nothing. The board meeting is Friday, he said. I know. You know because I called it, she said quietly. The meeting wasn't your board's idea. They came to me. 2 of them have known about Riven's involvement for 6 weeks. He went very still. Which 2? Marcus Webb and Patricia Lauren. Marcus Webb had been at his company from the beginning. Had been in his office 4 days ago sitting across from him talking about Q4 projections with a straight face. Patricia Lauren had called him 3 weeks ago to say she believed in his vision and the board's confidence was solid. They knew, he said flatly. They knew who you were and they didn't tell me. They knew I was the principal at Riven, she said. They didn't know I was your wife until last week. He stood up again. He walked to the window. He pressed his hand flat against the glass and looked out at nothing. Last week, he said. How did they find out last week? Because I told them, she said. Because by last week, I had decided that the only way forward was complete transparency with everyone. She paused. Including you. He turned from the window. The envelope in my briefcase. You put it there yourself. Yes. You knew I'd open it. I knew you couldn't not open it, she said. And for just a moment. Something that might have been the ghost of warmth crossed her face. You've never been able to leave something unknown on your desk. You have to know. That's who you are. He looked at her for a long time. The woman in the grey robe in the armchair in the corner. Slightly too far from the center of the room. Holding a glass of water with both hands. He looked at her like he was trying to do something he had apparently never quite managed in 6 years of marriage. Which was to actually see her. Tell me about Riven, he said. From the beginning. Tell me all of it. She looked at him for a moment as if verifying that the question was real. Then she set down her water glass. She pulled her legs up under her in the chair. And she began to talk. She talked for 2 hours. She told him about the MBA program. About the professor who had told her she thought about risk differently than anyone he had taught in 20 years. About the first angel investment she had made at 28 with $40,000 she had saved working 70-hour weeks at a consulting firm in New York. She told him about the first company she had quietly restructured. A failing logistics startup in Chicago that nobody else believed in. And how she had turned it in 14 months and used the proceeds to fund the next one and the next, building a track record entirely in private. Entirely without press or profile or any of the public validation that Daniel's world ran on. She told him about the decision to formalize the firm. About the early partners. 3 people she still worked with daily. None of whom he had ever met. None of whose names he had ever heard because she had never brought that world home. She told him about the discipline it required. Not just professionally. Personally. The constant management of a life that existed in 2 registers simultaneously. The quiet domestic one and the invisible professional one. And how over time the distance between the 2 had begun to feel less like strategy and more like loneliness. She did not say that last word. But he heard it underneath everything else she said, running through it like a wire. When she finished. The clock on his desk said 4:47 in the morning. The sky outside was beginning to shift from black to the particular dark blue that comes before dawn. The meeting Thursday, he said, in San Francisco. The Rivendell offices, she said. The full board will be there. The acquisition terms will be formalized. You'll need to be there as CEO or as whatever you decide you are by then. He heard the "or whatever you decide you are." He did not miss it. And us, he said. She stood up from the chair. She picked up her water glass. She looked at him with those eyes that he was only now beginning to understand had always been offering him something he had been too busy to receive. "That's a different meeting," she said, "and the timing is yours." She walked to the door. "Myra," she stopped. But didn't turn fully. Just enough to show she was listening. "I'm sorry," he said, "not for anything specific yet. I'm still figuring out what specifically." But he stopped. "I'm sorry." She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. She went upstairs. He sat at his desk until the sun came up, and he did not open his laptop, and he did not look at the acquisition offer, and he did not think about the board meeting or the numbers or the company that his wife had apparently been quietly keeping alive while he was busy believing he was doing it himself. He thought about a second date at a wine bar on California Street 12 years ago, and a woman who had sat across from him all evening and listened. Really listened while he talked about himself, and who had made a decision that night that had cost her something. He was only beginning to understand the size of. He thought about all the dinners and the car rides and the business trips and the phone calls and low voices, and he thought about how much a person could know about you without you ever once asking what they knew, and he thought about the word loneliness, which she had not said but which he now felt the shape of completely because it was the same shape as his own, just hollowed out from a different direction. At 6:15 he went upstairs. She was asleep, or she was doing a very good impression of it. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he went to his side of the bed. The left side. Always the left side, and lay down and stared at the ceiling, and finally somewhere around 7 o'clock in the morning fell into something that was not quite sleep but was close enough. His alarm went off at 8 o'clock. He had a company to face, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he was not sure he was ready. He was in the car by 9:15 driving to San Francisco on 3 hours of sleep and a cup of coffee that tasted like burned ambition, and the whole way there he kept running the same thought on a loop that he couldn't shut off no matter how loud he turned up the radio. His wife had been saving his company for 2 years without telling him. Not undermining him. Not competing with him. Saving him. Quietly. Methodically. The way she did everything. With a precision that left no fingerprints and asked for no credit. He merged onto the 101 and gripped the wheel a little tighter. Eli had texted at 8:45. 4 words. "You need to call me." He hadn't called. He wasn't ready for Eli's version of this yet. Which would be rational and strategic and organized into bullet points, because that was how Eli processed crises. And Daniel's crisis right now was not the kind that responded well to bullet points. He drove. He thought. He tried to build a version of the next few hours that made sense. And every version he built collapsed somewhere around the part where he walked into a boardroom and faced 2 people who had known his wife's secret for 6 weeks while shaking his hand and telling him the board had full confidence in his leadership. Marcus Webb. Patricia Lauren. He had known Marcus for 9 years. Had been best man at Marcus's second wedding. Had called him the night his father died at 11 p.m. Because Marcus was the kind of friend you called at 11 p.m. And Marcus had stayed on the phone for 2 hours saying almost nothing but being completely present. And Marcus had known. For 6 weeks. He had sat across from Daniel in that office 4 days ago, and he had known that Daniel's wife owned the firm that was buying his company, and he had said nothing. The betrayal of that sat differently than Myra's silence. With Myra. He was just beginning to understand the architecture of her reasons. With Marcus. He had no such framework, and the absence of it left something sharp and unprocessed sitting in his chest the whole drive up. He parked in a structure 2 blocks from the address Myra had sent him. He sat in the car for 4 minutes. He checked his phone. No new messages from Myra. One more from Eli Daniel. "Call me before you go in." He called. Eli picked up on the first ring. "Where are you?" "2 blocks away." Daniel said. "Okay." A pause. "How are you doing?" "I've been better." "Yeah." Another pause longer. "Listen. Before you go in. There's something you need to know that I found out this morning." Daniel's hand tightened on the phone. "Tell me." "The acquisition offer." Eli said. "The 280 valuation." I've been running numbers since 6 a.m. Daniel. That's not what the company is worth on the open market right now. Not even close. We both know that. A clean sale in the current environment. Given the Q3 numbers and the debt structure, we'd be lucky to see 220, maybe 215. Daniel was quiet. Myra's firm offered 280. Eli said. She overpaid deliberately by somewhere between $50 and $65 million. He let that land. That's not an acquisition. Daniel. That's I don't even know what to call that. I do. Daniel said quietly. He knew exactly what to call it. He just needed a minute before he could say the word. Because the word was something he wasn't sure he had earned the right to receive. Are you going in? Eli said. Yes. Do you want me there? Daniel thought about it. No. He said. Not yet. I'll call you after. He hung up. He got out of the car. He walked 2 blocks in the San Francisco wind, which was cold enough to be clarifying in a way that coffee hadn't been. And he found the building. A clean unmarked office tower on Mission Street. Nothing on the directory in the lobby for Riven Equity Partners. Just a suite number that the security desk confirmed when he gave his name. The man at the security desk said, Mr. Westbrook. You're expected. Suite 1400. Ms. Sultani said to go right up. Ms. Sultani. Not Mrs. Westbrook. He rode the elevator to 14. The doors opened and everything he thought he was about to walk into rearranged itself completely. The suite was not what he had pictured. He had pictured the standard architecture of Silicon Valley power glass and steel and expensive minimalism and a receptionist who looked like she had been hired to intimidate. What he found was quieter than that. Deliberately quieter. A reception area that felt like a library. Dark wood low-light bookshelves on one wall. No branding. No logo. No signal of scale. 2 people at desks who looked up when he entered and immediately looked back down, and Myra standing by the window at the end of the hallway in the same blazer she'd been wearing when she left the house that morning, talking to a man Daniel had never seen. Mid-50s, silver hair. The posture of someone who had been in serious rooms for a very long time. She saw Daniel. She said something to the man. He nodded and walked in the other direction. She walked toward Daniel. You came, she said. You knew I would. I hoped, she said. A beat. There's a difference. He looked around the reception area. This is it, he said. This is Riven. Part of it, she said. We have offices in London, Singapore and Dubai. This is the founding office. He absorbed that. London, Singapore, Dubai. The geography of it. The sheer quiet size of what she had built pressed against the inside of his chest. Who was that man? He said. James Harrington. He manages our European portfolio. He flew in for today. She paused. The full team is here. Everyone who matters to the acquisition is in that room. She nodded toward a set of closed double doors at the end of the hall. They're ready when you are. Are Marcus and Patricia in there? Something shifted in her expression. Not guilt. She was past performing guilt for him and he had stopped expecting it. But awareness. An acknowledgement that she understood exactly why he was asking in that particular tone. Yes. She said. Did you know that was going to be hard for me? Yes. She said again. I'm sorry about that specifically. The decision to bring them in. I needed board allies before the offer went forward. I should have found another way. It was the direct apology she had offered him, and it landed differently than the others because it came with an admission of a choice she'd made. Not a circumstance she'd been trapped by. He nodded once. Let's go in. She pushed open the double doors. The boardroom had 8 people in it and Daniel knew 3 of them. Marcus Webb was at the far end of the table, and the expression on his face when Daniel walked in was not quite shame and not quite relief. It was the expression of a man who has been holding a very heavy thing for a long time and has finally been allowed to put it down. Patricia Lawrence sat 2 seats to Marcus's left, composed and still watching Daniel with the careful attention of someone who is trying to read the weather. The other 5 people he had never seen. 4 men and 1 woman. All of them projecting the particular quality of focused calm that comes from being very good at managing other people's chaos for a living. Daniel sat down across from Myra, who had taken the seat at the head of the table as naturally as if she had been sitting there every day for years, which he realized she probably had. "Thank you for coming," she said to the room. Not just to him. And then she began. He had heard Myra talk before. Obviously. 6 years of dinners and car rides and living room conversations. He had heard her voice in all its registers. Quiet. Careful. Occasional dry humor. The particular tone she used on the phone with her mother. He had never heard her run a room. It was not loud. It was not aggressive. It was the opposite of aggressive. She spoke at the same pace she always spoke, with the same economy of words, and every single person in that room listened as if missing a syllable might cost them something. She laid out the West Tech acquisition in 12 minutes. Precise and complete, the valuation rationale. The restructuring plan. The 18-month roadmap that her team had built. The projected recovery trajectory. Daniel sat and listened and tried to absorb 2 things simultaneously. The content of what she was saying and the staggering reality of who was saying it. Then Marcus Webb spoke. "Daniel," he said, "I owe you a conversation, and I'm not going to wait for a better time to have it." He put his hands flat on the table. 6 weeks ago. Rivant's legal team approached me as a board member with a material non-public disclosure about the acquisition. At that point, I had an obligation to the board and a conflicting obligation to you as a friend, and I handled it badly. I prioritized the legal obligation. That was the right call professionally and the wrong call personally, and I'm sorry. Daniel looked at him. He had known this man for 9 years. He had been best man at his 2nd wedding. He had called him the night his father died. "Did you know she was my wife?" he said. "Not at first." Marcus said. "I knew the principal at Riven only as Monsieur Sultani. When I connected the names," he paused. "That was 3 weeks ago, and by that point I had already decided the right move was to let Myra control the disclosure timeline because it was her story to tell. Not mine." Daniel held his gaze for a long moment. He wanted to be angry. He tried to find the clean, righteous shape of it. What he found instead was something more complicated. The recognition that Marcus in his position might made the same call, and the inability to be certain he wouldn't have. "We're not done talking about this," he said. "I know." Marcus said, "We don't have to be done." Then Patricia Warren leaned forward. She was 62. Had been on 3 other tech boards. And had a reputation in the industry for saying precisely what she thought in precisely as many words as it required. She said, "Daniel, I'll be direct. I've watched this company for 3 years. I believe in what you built. I also believe that without this intervention West Tech would have been non-viable within 14 months. The acquisition isn't a failure. It's a correction. And the question in front of all of us today is whether you can be the person who leads the corrected version." I saw a calm. The room went quiet. Daniel looked at Patricia. Then he looked at Myra. Myra was watching him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Open, attentive. Giving nothing away. But not hiding either. Waiting. "What does that mean exactly?" he said in practical terms. "If I accept the acquisition, what's my role?" Myra spoke. "That's your choice to make. Rivian's standard model keeps existing leadership in place through the restructuring period when we believe in the capability. The roadmap I've built assumes you're at the helm. But it only works if you're fully in. Not partially in. Not defending the old model while we build the new one. Fully in. And if I'm not," he said, "then we bring in a transition CEO and you take a board seat," she said. "You're compensated fairly either way. The company survives either way. But the version where you lead it, she paused, that's the version I built the plan around. He sat with that for a moment. She had built the plan around him. She had overpaid for his company by $65 million. She had overpaid for she had spent 2 years watching his mistakes and building the framework to correct them. And she had engineered the whole thing so that at the end of it, if he was willing, he could still be the one standing at the front of the room. He thought about what Eli had said in the car. That's not an acquisition. That's a he knew the word now. He had known it in the car. Actually, he just hadn't been ready to say it. It was love. Expressed in the only language she had trusted him to eventually understand. I need 24 hours, he said. Myra nodded. You have it. One of the other men at the table. The one nearest to Myra. Who had said nothing yet. And who Daniel had been peripherally aware of the way you're aware of the quietest person in a room. Spoke for the first time. Snorts, his voice was measured. British accented. Carrying the weight of someone who chooses words the way surgeons choose instruments. Mr. Westbrook, he said. I'm Thomas Reeve. I've been Rivant's operational director for 7 years. I've worked with Myra on every significant acquisition this firm has made. He paused. I want you to know something. And I want you to know it not as a business consideration, but as a personal one. Another pause. Shorter. In 7 years. I have never seen her build a recovery plan that assumed the original founder stayed in the seat. That's not how we work. We come in. We restructure. We install new leadership. We exit. That's the model. He looked directly at Daniel. She changed the model for this one. I want you to understand what that means. I'm hard. The room was very quiet. Daniel looked at Myra. She was looking at the table. For the first time since this entire thing had begun. Since the envelope on the kitchen counter. Since the coffee he hadn't touched. Since the 2 a.m. conversation in his office that had lasted until nearly 5 o'clock in the morning. She looked like what she actually was beneath all the composure and the precision and the practiced calm. She looked like a woman who was afraid. Not of the deal. Not of the room. Afraid of him. Afraid of what he was going to do with everything she had just allowed him to see. He stood up. I'll be in touch within 24 hours, he said to the room. Then to Myra. Walk me out. She stood. They walked out of the boardroom through the reception area to the elevator. She pressed the button. They waited. Thomas didn't have to say that. Daniel said. No, she agreed. He did it on his own. Does he do things on his own often? Never, she said. The elevator arrived. He stepped in. He held the door. Myra, he said. She looked at him. The 280 valuation, he said. Eli ran the numbers this morning. She said nothing. You overpaid, he said, by a lot. She held his gaze. The numbers reflected the full recovery value, she said, 18 months from now. Post-restructuring. 280 is conservative. That's not why you did it, he said. She was quiet for just long enough that he knew he was right. No, she said, it's not. He let go of the door. It closed between them. He rode down alone and in the lobby. Past the security desk. Where the man had called her Ms. Sultani. Without blinking out into the San Francisco wind that was still cold and still clarifying. He stopped on the sidewalk and stood there for a moment. His phone buzzed. Eli. How did it go? He started to type a response. Stopped. Typed again. He sent, she built the whole plan around me staying on as CEO. She overpaid by $60 million. She changed how her firm works for me. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. Eli sent Daniel go home. He put the phone in his pocket. He stood on that San Francisco sidewalk in the cold wind and he thought about the divorce petition in his closet at home. The 30 pages of cold legal language that he had assembled without once asking himself the right question. Which was not whether his marriage had failed. but whether he had ever really shown up for it in the first place. He thought about a man who built a company and believed that was enough, who came home to a woman every night and called the quiet between them peace, who dismissed the questions he didn't think to ask as questions that didn't need answers, who had been so busy being the person he believed himself to be that he had never once made room for the person sitting across from him to be fully, completely, dangerously real. He had asked for a divorce. He had asked for a divorce from the woman who had spent 2 years keeping his dream alive without asking for a single thing in return. He had almost let that happen. He walked back to his car. He sat in it. He did not start the engine for a long time. He sat in the parking structure in the quiet and the dark, and he let himself feel the full weight of it. Not the professional humiliation. Not the corporate complexity. Not the logistics of restructuring and recovery plans and board dynamics. Just the weight of a man realizing how close he came to losing something he had never truly appreciated. Built by a woman he had never truly seen, who had loved him in a language he had been too proud to learn. His phone buzzed one more time. It was Myra. One line. "The dog you've been saying we should get. I think it's time." He stared at the message. He read it 3 times. Then, for the first time in longer than he could remember. Longer than the Q3 reports. Longer than the silent dinners. Longer than the whole slow unraveling of a marriage he had been sleepwalking through. Daniel Westbrook laughed. It wasn't a big laugh. It wasn't a relieved laugh. It was the small, quiet, slightly broken laugh of a man who has just understood a joke that was told very gently a long time ago by someone who was still willing to tell it again. He started the engine. He drove home. He got home at 2:17 in the afternoon to an empty house. He knew it was empty before he opened the door. There was a particular quality to the silence of a house without Myra in it that he had never consciously registered before this week and could now identify from the driveway. It was a different silence than the one they had been living inside together. Less loaded. Less dense. Just ordinary quiet. The kind that didn't mean anything. He stood in the kitchen and looked at the counter where he had thrown the divorce papers 2 mornings ago. The counter was clean. Of course it was clean. Everything in this house was always clean. Always ordered. Always arranged with the quiet care of someone who treated her environment the way she treated everything else. With attention. With intention. With a precision that he had spent 6 years mistaking for detachment. He opened the refrigerator. He wasn't hungry. He closed it. He went to the hallway closet and stood in front of it for a long moment before opening the door and reaching to the back shelf where he had put his briefcase the night before. He unzipped the front pocket. The divorce petition was still there. 30 pages. His signature on the last one. Myra's signature line empty and waiting. He took it out. He sat down at the kitchen table with it. He read it from the beginning, which he had not actually done since the day his attorney handed it to him, because at the time reading it had felt like an act of commitment and he had been committed, and so he had signed it and put it away. Reading it now was a different experience entirely. It was a document about a marriage he didn't recognize. Not because the facts were wrong. The dates were correct. The shared assets listed accurately. The division of property handled with a clinical fairness that attorneys are paid to produce. But because the narrative it implied, the story it told between its legal lines, was the story of 2 people who had run out of reasons to be together. And as he read it page by page, he kept waiting for the part where that was true and kept not finding it. They hadn't run out of reasons. He had stopped looking for them. His phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen expecting Eli or Marcus or someone from the West Tech office needing something that felt urgent and was actually just loud. It was his father, Richard Westbrook, calling at 2:23 on a Thursday afternoon, which he did perhaps twice a year and always with a specific purpose and always in a way that left Daniel feeling vaguely smaller than he had before he picked up. He almost didn't answer. He answered, "Dad." Daniel. His father's voice was what it had always been. Precise. Calibrated. The voice of a man who had spent 40 years in corporate law and had never quite left the courtroom even when he was standing in his own kitchen. I heard something interesting this morning. Daniel's hand tightened on the phone. What did you hear? Gerald Howe called me. His father said. He mentioned something about a Riven acquisition of your company. Gerald Howe. The venture capitalist from the dinner party 18 months ago who had spent most of the evening in quiet conversation with Myra at the other end of the table while Daniel held court. Of course Gerald Howe knew. Of course the information was already moving through the network in the specific way that information moves in this industry. Not like news. More like weather arriving at different places at different times without anyone being able to say exactly where it started. It's being handled. Daniel said. Is it? Not a question. His father's not questions were a specific instrument honed over decades. Designed to communicate skepticism without the vulnerability of actually expressing it. Gerald said the acquiring firm is run by your wife. Yes. A pause. Long enough to mean something. How long have you known about this? 2 days. Daniel said. And you didn't call me? No. Daniel. Dad. He said it more sharply than he intended. Then took a breath. I'm handling it. I don't need. He stopped. Started again. I'm figuring it out. Another pause. Then his father said in a tone Daniel hadn't heard from him in years. Something almost careful. She's been running Riven Equity Partners the whole time you've been married. Before that. Actually. 9 years. Silence. And you didn't know? His father said. No. How? It was such a simple question. 4 letters. And the answer Daniel was discovering was not simple at all. It was layered and uncomfortable and pointed directly at things about himself that he had been successfully avoiding for the better part of his adult life. But his father had asked it with something in his voice that Daniel couldn't immediately categorize. And so instead of giving the deflecting answer he would normally give, he found himself saying something true. Because I didn't ask. He said. I didn't ask her what she did. I didn't ask who she talked to or what she thought about or what she was building. I came home every night and I talked about West Tech. And I assumed her life was smaller than mine because I never gave it the same attention I gave my own. The silence this time was different. Longer. And when his father spoke again, his voice had lost some of its courtroom architecture. Your mother used to say that. Richard Westbrook said quietly. That I never asked. Daniel had not expected that. He sat very still. She said it for years. His father continued. I told myself she meant it about the small things. What she wanted for dinner. What movie she wanted to see. I made myself believe it was small. A pause. It wasn't small. Daniel's parents had divorced when he was 16. He had never fully understood why the official version had been growing apart, which was the language adults used when they didn't want to explain things to their children. And he had accepted it at 16 and never revisited it at 38. He had filed it away under family history and moved on the way he moved on from everything that didn't have an action item attached. Dad. He said. And then he didn't know what to say next. So he just held the phone and let the silence exist between them without trying to fill it. Which was not something he did often. Fix it. His father said finally. His voice was back to its normal register. Direct. Unadorned. Without the brief opening it had just contained. Whatever you need to fix. Don't wait until you have to look back. He hung up. Daniel sat at the kitchen table with the divorce petition in front of him and the phone in his hand and the particular feeling of a man who has just learned something about his own history that reframes everything he thought he understood about where he came from and why he is the way he is. He thought about his father in a courtroom, precise and calibrated and brilliant at reading every person in the room except the one who slept beside him. He thought about himself in a boardroom. Same qualities. Same blind spot. Different decade. He picked up the divorce petition. He walked to the shredder in his office. He fed it through page by page. All 30 of them. And he stood there and listened to the machine do its work. And when it was done, he felt neither relieved nor resolved. Just quieter. Like a decision had been made at a level below decision-making. In the part of a person that knows things before the rest of them catches up. He called Eli. "I'm accepting the acquisition," he said when Eli picked up. "A beat." "Okay," Eli said carefully. "Walk me through your reasoning." "Patricia was right," Daniel said. "Without the intervention, we had 14 months. Maybe less. The 280 valuation gives everyone. The employees. The investors. The people who built this thing with us a fair outcome. And the restructuring plan Myra's team built is the best strategic document I've read in 3 years. And I've read it twice now. And I can't find a flaw in it. That's the business case," Eli said. "What's the rest of it?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. "She built the plan around me staying on as CEO." "Eli, she didn't have to do that. That's not how Riven works." "I know," Eli said quietly. "She changed how her firm works." "I know. For me." "Daniel." Eli's voice was the voice of someone who has been watching a friend be slow about something obvious. And has decided that patience has its limits. "I've known for 6 years that you didn't understand what you had. I tried to tell you once after that dinner in Nob Hill, where Myra spent 40 minutes talking to that economist from Barclay, and you spent the whole drive home talking about the parking. I said, 'Your wife is remarkable,' and you said, 'Yes. She's great,' and changed the subject." A pause. "I should have pushed harder. I wouldn't have listened," Daniel said. "No." Eli agreed. "Probably not." They were quiet for a moment. "What about the personnel changes in the restructuring plan?" Eli said. Moving back to the practical. Because that was how Eli expressed care. "By helping you get the next thing right. There are some significant ones. I saw them," Daniel said. "Some of them are right. A couple I want to push back on. That's a conversation for next week." "And Marcus?" Daniel thought about Marcus's face in the boardroom. The expression that was not quite shame and not quite relief. "Marcus and I will work it out," he said. "It's going to be uncomfortable for a while and then it won't be." "Okay," Eli said. "What do you need from me right now?" "Nothing," Daniel said. "I need to find my wife." He hung up. Got back in the car and drove. He didn't have to think about where she would be. That was the thing he knew. He had always known in the background. Filed away with all the other things he hadn't thought were important enough to put in the front of his mind. When Myra needed to think. When she needed to be somewhere that wasn't a meeting room or their house with its 7 bedrooms and its immaculate surfaces. She went to the cottage. It was a small place on the coast 2 hours south that she had owned before they met. She had mentioned it once in the first year of their marriage and he had never asked about it again, and she had stopped bringing it up, and he had told himself it was because she rarely used it. He understood now that she used it regularly. He just hadn't been paying attention to when she left or when she came back. He drove south on the one where the road runs close to the water and the Pacific sits green and enormous on the right side of the car, and he thought about the man he had been for the last 6 years. The version of Daniel Westbrook that his industry knew. That his employees knew. That he himself had believed in completely, and he tried to figure out where that man ended and something more honest began. He had built West Tech from nothing. That was real. The intelligence. The drive. The capacity for work that was real. The vision he had for the company in its early years. The thing that had made people believe in it and build it with him. That had been real, too. But somewhere along the way, the building of the thing had become more important than the understanding of it. Success had calcified into identity. He had stopped being a person who was building something and become a person who was being someone, and the difference between those two states was enormous. And he had not noticed the crossing. He had brought the same blindness home. He arrived at the cottage at 4:45. Her car was in the narrow gravel drive. He parked behind it and sat for a moment. Then he got out and knocked on the door. She opened it after a long enough pause that he knew she had looked through the window first and made a decision. She was in different clothes than the boardroom. A soft sweater, jeans, hair down. She looked like herself in a way that the blazer in the boardroom had obscured. Or maybe he was just seeing her with different eyes than he had brought to every other version of this encounter. "You drove 2 hours," she said. "Yes. You could have called." "I know." She stepped back from the door. He came in. The cottage was small. A living room. A kitchen. A short hallway leading to a bedroom and a study. Bookshelves on every wall. Not decorative books. Red books. Books with broken spines and post-it notes. And pages turned down at the corners. A desk in the study visible through the half-open door. Papers spread across it in a pattern that looked like organized thought rather than chaos. This was where she actually lived. Not the 7-bedroom house in Atherton with its immaculate surfaces and its wine cellar nobody used. Here. He had not known this place existed in any real sense until this moment. "I shredded the divorce petition," he said. She turned from the kitchen where she had been filling a kettle. She looked at him. "When?" she said. "An hour ago." She set the kettle down. "Daniel, I'm not asking you to do anything with that information right now," he said quickly. "I'm not asking you to. I'm not coming here with a speech. I'm coming here because I owe you something that I should have given you a long time ago. And I don't want to wait any longer to give it." She was very still. "I owe you my attention," he said. "Real attention. Not the kind where I'm listening for a pause so I can talk. The kind where I actually want to know." He stopped. "I want to know who you are. I want to know what you built and why you built it and what it cost you and what it means to you. I want to know what you think about when you're in this room with all these books. I want to know what the Tokyo trip was actually about. I want to know what you and Gerald Howe talked about for 2 hours at that dinner party." He paused. "I want to ask you everything I should have been asking for 6 years. She looked at him for a long time. Her expression was doing something complicated. Not melting. Not breaking. Not performing the emotional release that a lesser version of this moment might have demanded. She was thinking. Actually thinking the way she did everything with the full weight of her intelligence behind it. "That's a lot of questions," she said finally. "I have time," he said. "You accepted the acquisition," she said. It was not a question. "Yes. I called Eli 20 minutes ago." Something moved through her face. Relief maybe, or the release of something she had been holding for a long time without knowing how long. "The restructuring timeline is aggressive," she said. "The first 90 days are going to be hard." "I know," he said. "I read the plan 4 times. I have notes." The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The possibility of one. "You have notes. 3 pages," he said. "Mostly questions. Some pushback on the personnel recommendations in the engineering division." He paused. "I think you're wrong about Kareem." She raised an eyebrow. "Kareem Hassan is underperforming against every metric. Kareem Hassan's wife had a premature baby 6 months ago and has been running on 4 hours of sleep." Daniel said. "He is one of the best engineers I have ever worked with and his numbers will recover when his life does. I should have said something to your team before now. That's on me. But he stays." She looked at him, and this time what moved through her expression was something he recognized because it was the thing he had seen in her face a long time ago on that second date at the wine bar on California Street when he had been talking about himself all evening and hadn't noticed the look of someone who is paying close attention to something they find genuinely interesting. She was looking at him like that now. "Okay," she said. "Kareem stays." He exhaled. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make tea." He sat at the small kitchen table. She filled the kettle and put it on. She moved around the kitchen with the ease of a person who knows a space, completely every cabinet and drawer. No searching. No hesitation. This was her real kitchen. The one in Atherton had always been, he understood now, a performance of domesticity for a life that hadn't quite fit. The dog, he said. She glanced at him. What about it? Your text this afternoon. I meant it, she said. I've wanted a dog for 4 years. You always said the timing wasn't right. The timing is right, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Just like that. Just like that. She turned back to the kettle. He watched her shoulders. The line of them. The particular way she carried herself that he had always registered as distant and now understood as self-contained. A person who had learned to take up exactly the space she needed and no more, because the space she operated in when no one was watching was so much larger. Myra, he said. MHM. The London office. The Singapore one. Dubai. He paused. How many people work for you? She was quiet for a moment. Across the full portfolio, directly and indirectly. She turned. Somewhere around 4,000. He stared at her. Full-time at Riven itself. She said 63 people. 63. He repeated. Yes. He sat with that number. 4,000 people. 63 at the core. An empire the size of which he was only now beginning to map. And she had been running it from a desk in a cottage on the California coast. In a quiet corner at dinner parties. And a seat in the slightly too peripheral armchair in his home office. Why did you never? He stopped. Found the right version of the question. What did it feel like carrying all of that and coming home to the life we had? She turned fully to face him. The kettle was starting to heat behind her. She leaned against the counter and crossed her arms. Not defensively. Just thoughtfully. The posture of someone organizing a real answer. Lonely. She said. Sometimes. Not always. She looked at the table between them. The work never felt like a burden I was hiding. It felt like the truest part of me. And I wanted you to know that part. I just kept telling myself there would be a better time. A safer time. A moment when telling you wouldn't change everything. And then the moment was always behind me. You were afraid. He said. Yes. Of what specifically? She met his eyes. That you would see the size of it and feel diminished. That it would change how you looked at me. Not with admiration. But with, she paused. Searching. With calculation. That I would stop being your wife and become your most valuable contact. I would never. He started. You wouldn't have meant to. She said. Not unkindly. Just honestly. But I've watched it happen to other people. I've watched relationships reorganize around money and power in ways that nobody planned. I was protecting what we had. What we had wasn't enough. He said gently. Not because of you. Because of me. I wasn't giving you a real marriage to protect. She was quiet. The kettle reached its boil. She turned. Poured the water. Brought 2 cups to the table. Sat down across from him. And for the first time since the morning of the envelope. Since all of this had begun to fracture and reassemble. They sat at a table together. And both of them were fully present in it. No performance. No avoidance. No careful management of the distance between them. Just 2 people drinking tea with the whole terrifying honest truth of their marriage on the table between them. Tell me about the first company, he said, the one in Chicago. The logistics startup. She looked up from her cup. Something shifted in her face. Something unlocked. Something that had been waiting behind the composure for longer than either of them had words for. It was a disaster, she said. For the first 4 months. And she began to talk. Not the way she had talked at 2 o'clock in the morning in his office. Which had been structured. Deliberate. A planned disclosure delivered with careful pacing. This was different. This was unplanned. This was a woman who had spent years being very controlled about what she let out, and was now in this small kitchen in this cottage where she actually lived, letting something out that didn't have a strategy behind it. She talked about the Chicago startup and the partners who didn't believe she could turn it around, and the months she had run out of operating capital, and had personally covered payroll from her own savings. She talked about the night she had called her mother, who had immigrated from Pakistan at 24 with $300 and an accounting degree, who had worked for 15 years as a bookkeeper for a company that had never once promoted her, who had looked at her daughter and said the same thing in Urdu that translated to prove them wrong with everything you have, not just some of it. She talked about the moment the Chicago turnaround worked. Not gradually, but a specific Tuesday morning in November when the numbers came in and she had sat alone in a rented office and understood for the first time in her life that she was not going to be stopped. Daniel listened. He did not check his phone. He did not think about West Tech. He did not plan his response or wait for a pause or position himself in the conversation. He just listened. And it turned out that listening, real listening, the kind he had been withholding for 6 years without knowing it, was the easiest thing in the world when you finally decided to do it. Outside, the Pacific was doing what it always did. Enormous and indifferent. And the light was going the way it goes on the California coast in the late afternoon. Golden and horizontal and undeserved by anyone in particular. Inside, something that had been broken for a long time was not yet fixed. You don't fix 6 years of silence in one afternoon. But it was beginning carefully and imperfectly to be rebuilt. At some point, without either of them marking it, the tea went cold. Neither of them noticed. They stayed at the cottage that night. Nobody planned it. Nobody announced it. It simply became obvious somewhere around 8 o'clock when the conversation had moved from Chicago to Singapore to the early years of Riven and back around to the specific Tuesday in November when everything had clicked into place for Myra that neither of them was going anywhere. Daniel had not brought a change of clothes. He did not care. For the first time in longer than he could accurately measure, the logistics of his own comfort were not the most important thing in the room. Myra made eggs. Simple ones, scrambled the way she always made them on the rare weekend mornings when they had been in the same kitchen at the same time without somewhere else to be. He had always eaten them without commenting. He understood now that she had learned to make them exactly the way he liked. Not runny. Not dry. A specific texture that he had never once told her he preferred. That she had simply observed and remembered and replicated without fanfare or acknowledgement. He told her that standing at the counter watching her cook. She looked at him sideways. The eggs. I never told you how I like them. No. She said. You didn't. How did you know? I watched you. She said simply. The first time you made them yourself. I watched how you did it. And then I just did it the same way. He stood there with that for a moment. It was such a small thing. And it was also not a small thing at all. It was the whole story in miniature. A woman who paid attention to everything. Who learned and remembered and acted on what she knew quietly and without asking for recognition. While the man beside her looked past her and called the view unremarkable. I'm sorry. He said. Not for the first time since this had all begun. But this time it came from somewhere deeper. Somewhere below the professional humiliation and the ego damage and the logistical complexity of the last 4 days. This time it came from the place where the real accounting happens. The place a person reaches when they have finally stopped managing their own narrative long enough to see the damage it has done. She slid the eggs onto 2 plates. She handed him one. She looked at him directly. I know. She said. I believe you. They ate at the small kitchen table and it was the best meal Daniel Westbrook had eaten in 6 years and the eggs were exactly right. He woke up the next morning on the couch. He had insisted she had not argued to the sound of her on a call in the study. Her voice low and precise. Conducting some piece of business that was beyond his visibility. He lay there for a moment listening to the rhythm of it without the words, and instead of the vague irritation he would once have felt at being in proximity to something he wasn't part of, he felt something quieter and more honest. Something like respect. Something like the beginning of actual understanding. He got up at 7:15. She was off the call by 7:30. They drove back to Atherton in separate cars because they had come in separate cars, and that was fine because some things don't resolve overnight and the expectation that they should is its own kind of problem. He followed her taillights on the one and thought about the next 90 days which Myra's restructuring plan had identified as the critical window. The period during which West Tech's new operational architecture would either hold or fracture. During which the personnel changes would either land or detonate. During which Daniel himself would either become the leader the plan required or prove that he couldn't. He was not afraid of the 90 days. He was ready for the 90 days. What he wasn't ready for arrived at 9:47 that same morning in the form of a text from Marcus Webb that said, "Only have you seen TechCrunch?" He hadn't. He pulled over and opened the app. The headline read, Riven Equity Partners acquires West Tech founder's wife revealed as billionaire behind mystery firm. He read it in the car on the shoulder of the coastal highway while Myra's car disappeared around the bend ahead of him, and he felt the specific chill of watching something private become public before you have finished understanding it yourself. The article was not vicious. It was worse than vicious. It was casual. It treated the story as entertainment. As a Silicon Valley twist worth 300 words of breezy analysis. It called Myra the quiet wife who turned out to be the quiet power. It called Daniel a CEO who didn't know his own board. It included a quote from an unnamed industry source describing the situation as the most dramatic acquisition story of the year and possibly the most awkward marriage in tech. He called Marcus. Marcus picked up immediately. "I'm sorry," he said. "I don't know where it came from. My office is looking into it. How much of it is accurate?" Daniel said. "Most of the business facts." Marcus said. "The personal framing is they don't have the full picture. Nobody has the full picture." Daniel said, "Except us." "I know." A pause. "What do you want to do?" Daniel sat on the shoulder of the highway and thought about it. In the old version of himself. The Daniel Westbrook who had thrown the divorce papers across the counter and believed that control was the same thing as strength. The instinct would have been to respond. To issue a statement. To manage the narrative. Shape the story. Ensure that the public version of events reflected the version of himself he needed the world to see. He didn't feel that instinct now. What he felt instead was something simpler and more protective. He thought about Myra. Who had spent 9 years building something extraordinary in deliberate privacy. Who had made the choice to stay invisible. Not because she was ashamed of what she had built. But because she understood that visibility came with a cost she wasn't willing to pay. He thought about what it would mean to her to have that privacy stripped away by a 300-word article that turned her life's work into a punchline about an awkward marriage. "Nothing," he said. "We do nothing. No statement. No response. No engagement. We let it pass. Some of the board members are going to want, the board members can want whatever they want." Daniel said. "This isn't their marriage. No statement." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said. "Your call." "Yes." Daniel said. "It is." He hung up and called Myra. She picked up on the second ring. "I saw it," she said. "I know. I'm sorry. Don't apologize for something you didn't do. I'm apologizing for the fact that you're dealing with this." A pause. Then dryly. "I've dealt with worse." "I know you have." "But," he said. "That's not the point." He stopped. "How are you?" Another pause shorter. And what was in it was something he hadn't heard from her in a very long time. The slight softening of someone who has been asked a question they weren't expecting and found against all probability that they want to answer it honestly. "I'm okay," she said. "Mostly." A beat. "Ask me again tonight." "I will," he said. And he meant it. which was the part that mattered. He got back on the road. By the time he reached the West Tech offices at 11 a.m., the article had been shared 400 times and his inbox had 47 emails. Most of them from people he knew. All of them wanting something. A comment. A confirmation. A denial. A piece of the story. He deleted all of them without responding. He walked through the office and the quality of attention he received from his employees was different than it had ever been. Not the deference of people managing their CEO, but the unguarded curiosity of people who have just learned something unexpected and don't quite know what it means yet. He stopped at Kareem Hassan's desk. Kareem looked up startled. He was 34. One of the best engineers Daniel had ever hired, and he looked the way people look when they have been running on insufficient sleep for 6 months. Competent but fraying at the edges. Holding it together through sheer professional discipline. "How's the baby?" Daniel said. Kareem stared at him for a moment. "She's good. She's doing really well. Actually, she came home from the NICU 2 weeks ago." "I didn't know that," Daniel said. "I should have known that. That's on me." He paused. "Take whatever time you need this month. Flex schedule. Remote. Whatever works. Your job isn't going anywhere." Kareem looked at him the way people look when they are trying to determine if something is real. Then he said quietly, "Thank you. That means a lot." Daniel nodded and kept walking. He spent the rest of the morning in his office going through the restructuring plan one more time. Not defensively. Not looking for flaws to argue against. But looking for the places where he could genuinely add value. Where his knowledge of the company's history and its people could make Myra's framework more precise. More human. More likely to hold. He found 7 of them. He wrote them up in a document that was direct and specific and contained exactly 0 ego protection. He sent it to Myra at 12:45 with a subject line that said, "My notes. Push back where I'm wrong." She responded at 1:03. 6 words. "3 of these are very good." He wrote back. "Which 3?" She sent back the numbers. He looked at them. 2 of them were the ones he'd been most confident about. The 3rd surprised him. He wrote, "I didn't think you'd agree on the Singapore timeline." She wrote back, "I didn't at first. Then I read your reasoning twice. You're right about the regulatory window. I'm updating the plan." He sat with that for a moment. She had read his reasoning twice. She'd updated the plan. Not begrudgingly. Not with qualification. Just cleanly because his input had value and she was willing to act on it. He understood sitting at that desk that this was what a real partnership looked like. Not 2 people managing each other's expectations. 2 people actually building something together in real time with their real capabilities fully in the room. He had never had that before. He had thought he had in the early years of West Tech with early partners and early investors. The excitement of the startup phase when everyone is too tired and too committed to protect their territory. But this was different. This was with someone who knew him completely, who had seen the worst of his blind spots, who had every reason to protect her own position, and was choosing not to. He called her at 2:30. She picked up. "The Singapore thing," she said immediately. "I've been thinking about it more. If we shift the timeline by 3 weeks. That's not why I called," he said. A pause. "Oh. I want to talk about the house," he said. She was quiet. "The Atherton house," he said. It doesn't feel right for either of us." "I don't think it ever did. I think we bought it because it was the house 2 successful people were supposed to have. Not because it was the house we actually wanted to live in." She said nothing. But the quality of her silence was the listening kind. "The cottage," he said, "that's your real house. I can see that now." He paused. "I want to know if there's room in it for me. Not as a transaction. Not as part of the restructuring. Not because the alternative is legally complicated. Because I want to be in the house where you actually live." I want to be in the same room as the real version of your life. A very long pause. Then Myra Sultana said in a voice that was quieter than her boardroom voice. And steadier than her 2 a.m. voice. And more honest than anything he had heard from her in 6 years of marriage. It has 2 bedrooms. The second one is full of boxes. I'll move the boxes, he said. There are a lot of boxes. I have time, he said. We established that. He heard something then that he had not heard from her in longer than he could accurately remember. She laughed. Not politely. Not performed. A real laugh. Short and low. And slightly surprised at itself. The laugh of someone who did not see a thing coming and was glad it arrived. Okay, she said, come move the boxes. He was there by 4 o'clock. The boxes were genuinely numerous. Books. Mostly additional books beyond the ones already on the shelves. Packed in careful layers with spines labeled in her handwriting. Business texts. History. 3 boxes of what turned out to be literary fiction. 1 box labeled Tokyo that he did not open because some things get revealed in their own time. He moved them to the small storage room at the back of the cottage and stacked them with more care than he had given to most things in recent memory. She did not help. She sat at her desk in the study and worked, and every 20 minutes or so, she would say something through the open door. A question about the Singapore timeline. A comment about an email she had just received from Thomas Reeve in London. Once a completely non-work-related observation about a neighbor's dog that had apparently been walking past the window. He answered everything. He kept moving boxes. At 6:15. Eli texted. The TechCrunch thing is dying down. No second wave. You were right to say nothing. He wrote back. Good. See you Monday. Eli wrote. How are you doing? Real answer. He looked at the message. He looked at the half-empty room and the shelves of books and the sound of Myra on another call in the next room. Her voice low and precise and completely herself. He wrote back. Better than I've been in years. Ask me again in 90 days. Eli sent a single thumbs up. Then a moment later. For what it's worth. She's the best thing that ever happened to your professional life and your personal one. Took you long enough to notice. Daniel looked at that message for a long moment. Then he put his phone in his pocket and kept moving boxes. The twist that nobody in the industry saw coming happened on a Monday morning 3 weeks later when Riven Equity Partners issued a formal press release announcing not just the West Tech acquisition, but the full restructuring plan co-authored by Myra Sultani and Daniel Westbrook. Described in the release as a collaborative strategic vision developed by Riven's principal and West Tech's founding CEO. It was the first time Riven had ever put a name to its principal in a public document. It was also the first time Daniel's name had appeared in a professional context alongside Myra's. And the industry noticed both facts simultaneously and spent 2 weeks trying to figure out which one was more significant. The answer, which neither of them offered publicly, was that both were equally significant and both had been a long time coming. The restructuring moved fast. Myra had been right about the 90-day window. It was aggressive and unforgiving. And there were 3 moments in the first month alone when Daniel was certain something was going to break before they could hold it. The second week. When the engineering department reorganization went sideways and 2 team leads threatened to walk. He called Myra at 11 p.m. from his West Tech office and said, I need your read on something. And she said, tell me. And they worked through it for 45 minutes on the phone. And by the end, he had a path forward and she had caught 2 things in his reasoning that he had missed. He told her she was right about both of them. She said, I know. But thank you for saying it. He laughed. She laughed. And then they hung up and went back to work because that was what they did now. Because that was what 2 people who were actually partners did when the work was hard and the stakes were real. The dog arrived on a Wednesday. A 3-year-old rescue mutt of indeterminate breed. Brown and white. With ears that couldn't agree on a direction. selected by Myra from a shelter in Half Moon Bay with the same careful methodology she applied to everything, which meant she had visited 3 times and reviewed the shelter's behavioral assessments before making a final decision. She did not tell Daniel she had made the selection until the dog was in the car. He got a text at 2:15 p.m. I named him Thursday. He stared at the message. Then he wrote back. Why Thursday? She wrote. Because that's the day you showed up. He read that message 4 times. The 4th time he had to put his phone face down on his desk for a moment and look at the ceiling. When he picked it up again, he wrote, "That's the best name I've ever heard." Thursday, the dog moved into the cottage that afternoon and immediately claimed the armchair in the corner of the study. The slightly too peripheral one. The one Myra had chosen when they furnished the Atherton house. Positioned just outside the main geography of the room, he settled into it with the complete confidence of an animal that has identified exactly where it belongs. And he looked at both of them from that chair with an expression of calm, undemanding presence that Daniel found, for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, profoundly moving. He stood in the doorway of the study looking at the dog in the chair and at Myra at the desk and at the walls of books and the papers spread in organized patterns and the whole modest, real, completely unlied about landscape of his wife's actual life. And he felt something he had not felt in so long that it took him a moment to name it. He felt at home. Not in the way he had felt at home in the 7-bedroom house in Atherton, which was the feeling of a man surrounded by evidence of his own success. This was different. This was the feeling of a person who has found the right room and the right people and has finally, imperfectly, with full awareness of the time it took and the cost of that time, decided to stay. The Atherton house sold 8 weeks later. Neither of them attended the closing. They were in Singapore for the Riven Portfolio Review, sitting side by side at a conference table for the first time in a professional context. And when the real estate agent sent the confirmation email, Myra forwarded it to Daniel with no comment, and he forwarded it back with a single word. Good. It was good. Everything that house had represented. The performance of a life rather than the living of one. The immaculate surfaces and the careful silences and the wine cellar nobody used and the marriage conducted entirely in the space between 2 people who had stopped asking each other questions was gone. What remained was smaller, louder, more honest and more alive than anything that house had ever contained. 6 months after the morning of the 2 envelopes, West Tech's Q2 numbers came in at 112% of the restructured projection. Daniel sent the report to Myra at 7 o'clock in the morning with the subject line, "You were right about the timeline." She wrote back 9 minutes later, "We were right about the timeline." He read that and set the phone down and drank his coffee, which was exactly the right temperature in a kitchen that was too small and had books stacked on the counter and a dog asleep in the next room. And he thought about a man who had once stood in an immaculate kitchen holding an envelope he hadn't expected and had understood nothing about the life he was actually living. That man felt very far away now. Not because Daniel Westbrook had become someone else. He was still precise. Still driven. Still the person who took notes in the margins and pushed back in meetings and needed to know what was in an unexpected envelope before he could leave it alone. But he was also now the person who asked. Who listened when the answer came, who had learned later than he should have. But not too late. That the most important question a person can ask is not the one that makes them look capable. It is the one that makes someone else feel seen. Myra knew this. She had always known this. She had spent 9 years building an empire and 6 years waiting for her husband to understand what she had understood from the beginning. That real power is not what you accumulate. It is what you choose to see in the person sitting across from you. He saw her now. That was not nothing. That was in fact everything. And on a Wednesday evening in a small cottage on the California coast with a dog named Thursday asleep in the armchair and the sound of the Pacific doing what it always did outside. 2 people sat at a kitchen table that was too small for the life they were building and talked until the tea went cold and neither of them noticed and neither of them stopped.